The story I'm about to tell you is perhaps the strangest and most unsettling thing that's ever happened to me. And now that I have some years to think about it, I understand just how weird it truly is. It was around 10 years ago, give or take. My wife and I loved to hike, and we still love to hike to this day. Specifically, we love to hike in this fall season. We live in the northern east coast of the United States, and the way the leaves turn during the weather change is really remarkable. Not to mention, fall isn't too warm, so it makes the hikes much more bearable. We spend the first few weekends of the fall season hitting some local trails. As October approached, we started to venture further from home and hike some more intense trails, the types of hikes that take an entire day to complete. On one specific October afternoon, we decided to hike an unmarked trail. We both were experienced hikers, and we didn't plan on staying overnight or anything like that. My wife especially was very good at navigating the forest and just being cautious of her direction and the course she takes. And that's why going off trail and taking an unmarked route wasn't that big of a deal for us. Around midday, we decided to take a break in a nice little clearing. It was hard to believe that people didn't travel to this section of the woods. It was almost like this little pocket of the woods was designed for hikers to take breaks. It was a circular little spot of the forest with 2 tree stumps. We each sat on a stump and ate a protein bar, and we decided to take a 15-minute break before heading back out into the forest. Right before heading back into the woods, we heard a noise coming from just beyond the trees. We both paused and listened to the rustling noise. In these specific woods, there were plenty of animals that could do some serious harm to us if we weren't careful. The more we kept listening to the noise, the more unsure that we were of what animal it could be. It was clearly something making that noise and not just the wind. I said that we should just stay put for a while until the noise stopped, but my wife wanted to check out whatever was beyond the thick brush. I can't blame her. I was curious as well. I just didn't want to risk being mauled by a bear or something. We proceeded with caution, trying to be as light on our feet as we possibly could, and even writing this now, I still can't believe what we saw. Now, pacing rather erratically back and forth seemed to be a young woman. A very pretty young woman, I might add, most likely in her early to mid-20s. She had blonde hair and blue eyes from what I could see, and she was wearing a beautiful white dress that went down to her knees. The strangest part was that she seemed to be shoeless. Her feet were dirty, and the dirt seemed to spread up to her legs and calves. Now, I'm sure you're asking yourself, why didn't we go and help the woman who was clearly lost or in distress? Well, to answer your question, we kinda did. Or tried, at least. We didn't want to approach her because she was being very erratic with all of her movements, hands swaying all around and body moving from left to right. She was mumbling and talking to herself, but we couldn't make out exactly what she was saying. It was more like groans mixed with occasional laughter. So, instead of approaching this clearly unwell woman, we called out to her. At first, she didn't react. She just kept hopping around the woods erratically, almost like a frog, you know? And then we shouted again, much louder this time. She must have heard us because now she stopped in her tracks. She didn't move at all. She just stood there. No more mumbling and no more movements. My wife took a step forward and asked the woman if she was all right and if she needed any help. And instead of answering, the woman turned around and hissed at my wife. And I'm not kidding either. This woman straight up hissed like a cat and then turned and sprinted into the woods in the opposite direction of where we were standing. I basically stayed put, but my wife chased her for a little while. She yelled at me that we wouldn't just let this poor girl stay in the woods all by herself. A few minutes into the chase, my wife just gave up. Not because she didn't want to continue, but because the woman was so fast that she was able to outrun my wife, even with no shoes. I stayed in the area where we originally found the woman, and my wife ran back to where we started our hike. She called the ranger and informed them of what had happened, and she took the ranger to the spot where I was waiting just in case the woman ever came back. The ranger gave us a nice verbal smackdown for hiking in areas we weren't supposed to hike, but where we were wasn't technically illegal, so we didn't get in any real trouble. And my wife was upset that the ranger didn't seem to care about the woman that we saw. We both had gotten the impression that the park ranger thought that we were making up some sort of elaborate story. They started to search for the woman eventually, but after a few days they never found anyone, and they said that they had never even found any evidence that a person had been out there. They even checked our description of the woman with the women who had recently gone missing, but our mysterious woman didn't seem to match any of those poor girls. We never received any answers about this weird occurrence in the woods. My wife even went back to these woods several times and tried searching for any sign of the woman, but she never got any answers. We did take some solace in the fact that no woman matching that description was ever reported missing, or worse, found dead. And I don't know what we saw that day. I have no idea where that woman came from or where she went. All I know for sure is that she was clearly not in the correct state of mind, and she was very, very fast.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
This happened a few years ago while I was living in Florida. I'm a female and around 20 years old. I had been going through a pretty rough patch in my life and had the great idea to take a few tabs of LSD and go to St. Augustine for a day trip to take my mind off of everything. St. Augustine is notorious for being insanely haunted, but it's one of my favorite places to go. I went by myself and made the 3-hour drive. This wasn't out of the ordinary for me. I often went on adventures like this by myself, and I always had a great time. So I went to the historic downtown and spent my peak looking around all the cool shops, and even made one hell of a walk to the lighthouse. Passing by tons of tourists and people going about their day when you're tripping balls walks the fine line of exciting and terrifying, and I love that feeling. When I started coming down, I went back to my car and decided to go to the beach as there was still a solid 2 hours of daylight left. I thought being on the beach during sunset, while being in the more mental part of the trip, would be amazing. I found some random pull-off area that you had to drive down a mile or so before you hit the parking lot. Not one other car was in it, which was welcomed after being in crowds all day. And this lot was a giant circle and was surrounded by trees and marshy land. Off to the side was a boardwalk that you had to walk quite a ways down to get to the beach. Once I finally got to the sand, I left my shoes by the boardwalk so I could find where it was when I came back. I was still not in my right mind by any means, and the entrance was pretty well hidden. I then walked for a solid 45 minutes down the beach. I found a nice spot with a washed-up log where I could put my bag and clothes while I went for a swim. While I was in the water, I started getting to myself and thinking about all the stories about how extremely haunted this beach truly was. Not long after that, I had a very intense burning up my side. Think like if you get a severe scratch or cut and put rubbing alcohol on it immediately. So my high ass is thinking a ghost had just tried to take me into the depths, and I got out of the water as quick as possible. Upon closer inspection on the log, I realized that it was a jellyfish sting, and I laughed it off. The sun was going down quickly, and I remembered that I had quite a trek back to my car. The jellyfish sting was also a huge damper on my mood, so I grabbed up everything, and by the time I made it to the boardwalk again, it was dusk. The boardwalk was probably a half-a-mile walk back to my car. I had only barely started walking down it when I heard someone talking. A few seconds later, I came across a dirty, older-looking homeless man talking to himself, swinging around a huge machete at plants on the side. I froze in my tracks, not knowing what the hell to do. He was slowly walking in the direction I was, so I decided to try to keep pace with him and follow behind as quietly as possible. This was going well for about 5 minutes, and then he just stopped. I froze in place, not knowing what to do. I decided to just walk by as quickly and calmly as possible in hopes that he wouldn't say anything to me and just keep swinging his machete at the plants. As soon as I passed him, I heard him say something to me. He must have been on something too, because I couldn't understand what he said. I didn't look back and I didn't say anything at all, I just kept walking. I heard his footsteps start to follow behind me. I picked up the pace, hoping that he would lose interest. Unfortunately, this didn't happen. I heard him right behind me, following me a few feet behind. and every once in a while he'd say something, but I ignored him and never looked back. In my mind, I was convinced that if I looked back, he would attack me with that machete and it would be all over. He started saying things to me more frequently, but I still refused to look back or respond in any way. He was becoming angry that I wouldn't acknowledge him and began shouting. I felt the wind from the machete swing behind me and I started to just full-on run at that point. I knew the parking lot wasn't too far away by now, and I figured my heightened senses from that dose would easily allow me to outrun him. To my horror, he began running too. It was completely dark outside now and my adrenaline was in full force. I finally made it to the lot and somehow got my keys out of my bag in record time. I jumped in my car and floored it out of there. When I was coming out of the circle, I saw him standing off to the side of the road. He was screaming something and angrily swinging that machete around. I tried to come towards my car, but I honked the horn and drove past him, flying down the road away from this maniac. My friends had always warned me against these little adventures, as I was a young, fairly good-looking girl. It was a running joke that I'd get murdered one day while on one of these, and that experience made me realize how real of a possibility that could actually be.
This happened a few years back when I had just gotten hired at the local grocery store in my city. I was 16 at the time and definitely looked my age, if not younger. It's also important to mention that I'm quite a shy person as is, especially back then at my new workplace. I had been working there for a while when our store hired a new cashier. For this story, I'll call him Joseph. Overall, Joseph seemed pretty nice. He was always waving hello to everyone, greeting everyone at the start of his shift. Just fit in pretty well and seemed like a fairly normal guy, trying his best to befriend his coworkers. After a few months of working there, Joseph started trying to talk to me more frequently. This didn't seem weird, as cashiers tend to get close to anyone that they frequently work the same hours as. It's always nice to have someone to have short conversations with when the store gets quiet. It did escalate pretty quickly, with him going out of his way to talk to me about any chance he got, but again, he was fairly new and I assumed he was just being friendly. This changed one day as I'm getting off of work and he approached me as I was exiting the store and asked if I would like to get coffee with him. I was caught extremely off guard by this, and due to being shy and an anxious person, I stammered out a quick, yeah, sure. Immediately regretting this in my head, as I had zero attraction to Joseph, before I quickly ran out of the store to where my parents were waiting to pick me up. That day when I got home, I searched his profile on Facebook to see if I could find out more about him. It turns out Joseph wasn't actually as young as I assumed he was. He was 26 years old at this time. At this point, I will also mention that it was a known fact between all cashiers that me and a handful of other cashiers were all in high school. So knowing that I wasn't going to entertain the idea of coffee with him, the next day at work when I saw him, I told him that I wouldn't be able to get coffee with him as the age difference was too much for me. Unfortunately, this didn't seem to deter Joseph, who simply replied, "Does age matter to you? It doesn't matter to me." I replied with a quick, "Well, when you're almost 30 and I'm in high school, it matters a bit." This comment seemed to go unnoticed, as he stated how he would wait for me and how he could make me happy. This obviously creeped me out, and from then on I began to avoid Joseph as best as I could. However, he began to become very persistent. Every single shift I had, he either happened to be working already or would go through my till to buy a single item and continue to pester me for a date, asking me almost daily, "Have you changed your mind?" and telling me that he wasn't giving up. This may not seem like much for those reading, but being harassed daily by an older man in an environment where you were supposed to be safe was terrifying for me. I admit, if this had taken place now, I would have totally gone to HR or my manager and told them about the situation, but as a 16-year-old girl working her first job, I feared that I was overreacting. Eventually, after at least a couple of months of honestly being scared to go to work, I confided in a friend that I worked with that it was happening. This friend happened to be a huge 6-foot-tall man who said that he would talk to Joseph about his creepy behavior. Around the same time, I also told one of Joseph's closer friends at our workplace about his behavior and how it was upsetting me. And around this time, Joseph began to leave me alone, shortly after leaving the store entirely. I actually began to forget all about this until a year or so ago after it all happened, when I got a message from an old work friend who I don't typically talk to. Her message simply stated, "Did you see this?" and had a link below. The link was a mugshot from the Crime Stoppers unit in our town, a mugshot of Joseph, underneath which it said that there was a province-wide warrant out for his arrest for the charges of possession and distribution of illicit images containing children. I don't know what I avoided by not going out for coffee with him, and I can't say with certainty that anything would have happened, but boy am I glad my warning bells went off when they did.
In my early 20s, I went through a wandering stage. I had just graduated from college and couldn't find a job anywhere. Rather than go a couple $100 into the hole every month paying for rent while searching for a job, I decided to pack up with my few belongings I owned and headed out to see the country. And this is something I cannot recommend enough. Stay off the interstates, pop a train from time to time, and hitchhike with no particular destination in mind. It was this kind of aimless wandering that led me to the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. If you've never experienced them, the Barrens are an amazing place. Huge stands of oak and evergreen trees, many older than time itself, grow out of that strange, sickly soil. Sugar sand, the locals call it in the rainy season, that forms quicksand. And then the dry season, it can still swallow farm machinery whole. Of the few farms that I saw, they all looked like they had seen better times, and many looked like they had sat untouched for decades. There was something alluring about that place, a sort of ancient secret I was afforded glimpses of in the shadows when the wind stirred the trees. The sort of movement at the edge of your vision that follows you throughout the day, but disappears as soon as you turn your head. From time to time, I hiked down old dusty roads. An old pickup truck or a rusted-out car would bound over a hill toward me. Most times, the driver would eye me suspiciously and speed up as they approached. Occasionally, the driver would stop to talk to me for a few minutes. "What are you doing out here?" one old toothless man clad in overalls asked me wandering around. "Seeing what there is to see," I replied. The old man spat out a putrid brown stream into the dust. "Ain't nothing to see around here." When I asked the old man what he meant by that, he made a guttural, throaty sound. I wasn't sure if he was choking on his tobacco or bothered by the question, but he didn't answer. He offered me a ride in his pickup the way that I had come back into town. But when I declined, he spat out into the dirt again and sped off, shaking his head. My eventual plan was to make it to Delaware sometime that summer and meet up with some extended family there, but I was in no hurry. In truth, I had been in heaven these last few weeks, taking my time heading south and exploring anything that caught my eye. I had explored every abandoned building and every cave I had seen. I had half my weight in power bars in my backpack. But over the last 2 months, I had honed my skills at trapping rabbits and gathering wild edibles. Sitting up late at night beside my campfire and sleeping beneath the stars. The night sky in an area so devoid of human influence is beyond comprehension. But tonight, there were clouds moving in, and the sun was disappearing faster than I had grown accustomed to. When the deep roar of thunder shook the valley, I knew that I had better find shelter. In the failing sunlight, I could see in the distance some structures at the top of the hill. I ran the half-mile distance and was disappointed to see that the ancient house and barn were in terrible shape. The roof of the barn had been completely collapsed, and the upper 2 floors of this 3-story house had collapsed into a mangle of ancient wood. Still, the house was my best option, so I made my way toward it as the heavens began to open up. As I'd seen on other properties in the area, this house had a small cemetery in the yard. I ran toward the gaping front door of the dilapidated house, carefully making my way between the headstones. When lightning flashed, I was able to make out the name on several of the headstones, which the elements hadn't completely erased. When they got inside, the floor was spongy, but felt solid enough to hold my weight. I took off my pack and set it near the door, caught my breath, and had a look around. The hinges of the front door had long since rusted away, but I was able to fit the door back into the opening enough to hopefully keep the wind and rain out. At one end of the room, there was a stone fireplace and chimney which was solidly constructed, but I had no wood for a fire. Next to the fireplace was a stairwell full of rubble and cobwebs. I didn't dare apply my weight to those steps, as many had rotted to nothing under their own pitiful weight. Opposite the front door was an opening to an old kitchen of sorts, but when I tried to approach it, my foot went clean through the floor, and I decided to stay put until the storm blew over. The remains of the upper floor did an adequate job of keeping the ground floor dry, and I was able to arrange my sleeping bag so that very little water draining from the upper floors managed to land on it. I got out my harmonica and played for a few minutes, then stopped, apprehensive. I didn't know what I was afraid of, but something had chilled me to my core. Outside, the storm had continued to build in intensity. My eyes were focused on that stairwell, seeing nothing in darkness, and flash blinded when lightning struck. I must have fallen asleep at some point because suddenly I came to with a searing pain in my neck from leaning my head against the wall for so long. Outside, the storm continued to pound down its fury upon Earth. As I sat there, rubbing my neck, and began to chuckle to myself for getting wrapped up in the superstition of the area when I heard it. At first, I heard indiscriminate movement of stairs and the ruins of the upper 2 floors. I was just about to write it off as rats when suddenly it stopped. I froze in place, daring only to move my eyes, and even then, just barely. After 30 seconds of paralytic fear, I smiled at myself again and was just about to settle into my sleeping bag when I looked toward the stairs. At the top of the doorway were a pair of glowing red orbs staring directly at me. Very slowly, they closed down to horizontal slits, then opened up again wider than before. I can't tell you how long I sat there staring at it, staring at me. It could have been a second. It could have been hours. And eventually, my lower-level self-preservation skills began to kick in, and subconsciously, I started reaching for the knife on my belt. Our eyes locked. My hand progressed inch by inch towards my only means of defending myself. Neither of us blinked for what felt like hours, and while the storm raged on, I prayed for another lightning strike so that I might even catch a glimpse of my adversary. But despite the ferocity of the rain, the darkness was absolute. When, at last, my hand reassuringly touched the hilt of my knife, it seemed as if the very fabric of existence was ripped to shreds. The creature began bellowing in the most unearthly, mind-numbing shriek I'd ever heard. Knowing I only had one chance, in one fluid motion, I released the snap that held my knife in place and released an inside overhand throw that I had practiced during my years of my misspent adolescence. I heard a sickening, wet thunk, and the shrieking increased in volume 100-fold. As I smashed that rotten door to pieces, I heard the creature flapping against the wall and screaming. Just as I wrenched the remains of the door open, a great flash of lightning struck. And all around the house, I saw piles of bones, feathers, and fur. I ran as I had never run before, since I ran into my veins pumped acid and my limbs were stone. I couldn't see where I was going, but I could follow the dirt roads by the sounds of the sugar sand slipping roadside debris into the ditches. I didn't dare look over my shoulder. When the sun finally rose, I collapsed in the middle of the road. Heaving, oblivious to the downpour, I awoke with a startle to the sound of a car horn blaring inches from my head. I leaped to my feet and spun around to see the same old man from yesterday holding his sides with laughter. When I opened my mouth to speak, he motioned with his thumb to the back of his truck. I climbed in without a word, and he began to drive. The events of the previous night had began to replay themselves in my head. What had just happened? No matter how many times I considered what I saw, none of it made any sense. As we drove, I realized how far I had run in the dark. It must have been nearly 10 miles. I was angry with myself for being so terrified by a dream. And that's the only thing that could have been approached from this angle. Everything fit into place and experienced to false awakening. There's so many times in the past when experimenting with dream herbs. I had a nightmare and woke up with adrenaline pumping and abandoned all of my gear in an old house. I suddenly realized that the truck had sat motionless for quite some time, and the old man was turned around in the seat, staring at me. I looked up at him, and he grinned. With sickening horror, I realized that we were at the bottom of the hill on which that wretched house sat. I jumped out of the pickup and thanked the old man who drove off. I slowly walked up the muddy path that led to the house, composing myself. When I reached the yard, I saw the old piles of bones which had shocked me the previous night during the storm. Of course, there were coyotes and foxes in the area, and I had hunted a couple wild turkeys. The critters probably had their dens around here, and they had been using the house as a windbreak. Inside the house, everything appeared as I had left it. My sleeping bag, my pack, and my harmonica was sitting on the floor, and I could see my knife sticking out of the wall across the room. I packed everything up and put on my backpack, then walked over to the stairs and pulled my knife out of the wall. I was about to return it to the sheath on my belt when I looked at the blade and noticed the dried-on blood and that clump of oily black hair stuck to it.
This is an experience my wife and I just had this past year. As soon as the quarantine was lifted in our area, she and I filled our packs and went for a hike at our local state park. It was something we used to do pretty regularly and have since before we got married. Speaking for myself, I was looking forward to it. The plan was to hike out to a certain lake, spend the night, and hike back to the car. It was a clear, warm day, and the trails were nice and dry. For most of that morning, we had been the only people on the trail. We decided to stop for lunch at a campsite about halfway to the lake. Another couple must have had the same idea. They were sitting at the concrete picnic table, and we asked to join them. Soon, the four of us were discussing what we had seen and where we were headed. The couple turned out to be newlyweds on their honeymoon. My wife, who's a hopeless romantic, loves to hear this. She proceeded to tell them how we met and some other sappy stuff I don't bother to remember. 2 hours passed and we finally said our goodbyes. We arrived at the lake about an hour before dark, tired and hungry. I got a fire started, and Mandy, my wife, cooked us a small meal while I pitched the tent. We sat around the fire cooking s'mores and eventually called it a night around 10 p.m. I got up just before dawn the next morning and got the fire ready to make breakfast. We repeated our roles from the night prior, except I pulled the tent down and repacked it. Then measures were taken to assure the fire was completely out after cooking. And with that, we took to the trail for the return journey. At 10 a.m., we reached the halfway point, but chose not to stop. 2 hours of the trail, we ran into the couple we met the day before. Strangely, his wife wasn't with him. Mandy asked him about her location, and the man said she'd become ill the night before and returned home. When he said it, he looked nervous and couldn't look either of us in our eyes before either of us could ask anything else. He said that his wife had insisted he finish the trip alone. It sounded a bit strange, but we had no reason not to believe him. A group of people came walking up about that same time, and the husband excused themselves to talk to them. I wasn't interested in prying any further. Their marriage was none of my business. I thought Mandy looked like she wanted to stay, but I reminded her of the obligations we had that night. She reluctantly agreed, and we went on our way. We got to the parking lot not too long after and packed up our stuff. There were a few groups of people talking amongst themselves. As we pulled out of the lot, several more cars, including a Ranger's truck, were pulling in. Once again, I thought nothing of it. We made the news. We made it back home that afternoon and handled some family things. It wasn't until breakfast that we heard the news. I grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down in front of the TV. I flipped it on just in time to receive a report of a dead female camper. When they showed her face on the screen, I almost choked on my coffee. It was a picture of the woman we had met just 2 days prior. I yelled out to Mandy to join me in the living room. I wanted to be sure of what I was seeing. I didn't have my glasses on at the time, so I pointed at the TV and asked, "Isn't that one of the newlyweds we met at the park?" She watched for a moment and let out a shocked gasp. Just then, a wedding photo of a couple appeared on the screen. Mandy grabs the remote from my hand and turns up the volume. According to the husband, the couple had been at a cliffside that was a popular lookout. Mandy and I had been there once or twice ourselves in the past. They watched the sun rise, and as they were preparing to turn and leave, the wife lost her footing and fell several hundred feet to the ground below. It was certainly possible, but something bothered me about it. Why hadn't he mentioned this to us? More so, what was up with the illness story? It couldn't have been more than a few hours after the incident occurred. None of his behavior made any sense. I know if something had happened to me, I'd have been a mess. We passed at least 15 people that morning and not a soul talked to us. It all seemed fishy to me. I was glad to see that Mandy agreed with me. It looked as if her instincts had been right once again. Just don't tell her I said that. After a long discussion about our responsibilities and the like, we agreed that we should contact the law enforcement involved in the case. And as it stood, the husband isn't under any suspicion. Not publicly, anyway. I contacted the sheriff's office and told them what we knew. The deputy put us on hold for a moment, and when we returned, he said someone may reach out to us in the future. But it's been almost a year, and no one has contacted us. This is what brings me to email you here. What do you think? My instincts and my wife tell us that a crime may have occurred. We, however, have no proof or any real justification for our feelings. And that's just what they are. Feelings. Certainly, if law enforcement believed we had something to offer, they would have already contacted us, right? I don't want to be a nuisance, nor do I want to cause trouble for a grieving man who by all appearances is a decent person. But help me out here. Should I keep pushing or leave the police to do their jobs? I just can't shake this nagging feeling that a man is getting away with cold-blooded murder.